It was built to stop rockets in midair, to calculate trajectories in seconds, to decide what matters and what doesn't, faster than any human ever could. But under sustained pressure, even the most advanced systems stop being perfect and start making trade-offs. 600 missiles, not in a day, not spread across multiple phases. 3 hours. That is not a strike. That is a stress test. Wave after wave, incoming trajectories begin stacking on the radar, not sequentially simultaneously. The system doesn't get to finish one calculation before the next one arrives. It has to prioritize instantly, continuously, under load. And that is where the equation changes. If you want analysis that stays focused on how these systems actually behave under pressure, not just how they're supposed to work, stay with me. Because the moment volume crosses a certain threshold, the story stops being about interception and becomes about selection. At first, everything still looks controlled. Interceptors launch, targets are tracked, calculations are clean. The system is doing exactly what it was designed to do, filtering threats, not blindly reacting to everything in the sky. But then the spacing between incoming threats begins to collapse. Instead of discrete engagements, you now have overlapping ones, multiple impact predictions competing for priority. The system is no longer just solving trajectories, it is managing scarcity. And scarcity introduces friction. Each interceptor has a cost. Each launcher has a reload cycle. Each radar system has processing limits, not in theory, but in time. Milliseconds begin to matter. So the system starts making decisions that are invisible from the outside. Some threats are engaged immediately. Others are delayed fractions of a second that feel irrelevant until they aren't. And some are allowed through because the system calculates they will land in open areas. That logic is not failure, it is design. But design assumes something critical, that the volume of incoming threats remains within a predictable range. 600 missiles in 3 hours pushes beyond that assumption. Now the radar picture thickens. Tracks overlap. Priorities shift faster than interceptors can be reassigned. And something subtle begins to happen. The system doesn't collapse. It slows. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough. Enough for small gaps to appear between detection, decision, and interception. Enough for timing windows to narrow. Enough for the margin of error already small to shrink even further. And once the margin shrinks, the system becomes sensitive to saturation. Because missile defense is not about hitting everything. It is about hitting enough of the right things at the right time. But what happens when enough becomes mathematically impossible? As the barrage continues, another pressure point emerges. Interceptor availability. Every launch consumes inventory. Every engagement reduces future options. In a short engagement, this is manageable. In a sustained one, it becomes cumulative. The system is now not just reacting to the present, it is implicitly budgeting for the next 10 minutes, the next hour, the next wave that hasn't arrived yet. So decisions tighten. Targets that might have been intercepted earlier are now reconsidered. Risk tolerance shifts. The threshold for engagement rises. And that shift is where saturation truly begins to take shape. Not when the first missile gets through, but when the system starts adjusting its own behavior under pressure. On the ground, this doesn't look like a clean failure. Sirens still sound. Interceptors still launch. Some incoming threats are still destroyed midair. But the pattern changes. Interceptions are no longer evenly distributed. Some areas experience near total protection. Others begin to see leakage small at first, then more noticeable. That unevenness is not random. It is the result of prioritization under constraint. Urban centers receive focus. Strategic infrastructure receives protection. Lower priority zones absorb more risk. And that creates a second layer of pressure psychological. Because from the perspective of the population, the system was supposed to feel consistent, reliable, predictable. Instead, it begins to feel conditional. And once defense becomes conditional, perception changes. Not immediately, but enough to matter. Meanwhile, the barrage does not pause. There is no reset, no clean break between waves, just continuous input. That continuity is what transforms a defensive system from a shield into a filter under stress. And filters, by definition, cannot pass everything. They choose. They optimize. They accept loss at the margins to preserve function at the core. So the question is no longer whether the system works. It clearly does. The question is whether it can maintain that performance when the variables change faster than it can adapt. Because 600 missiles in 3 hours is not just an attack profile, it is a calculation, a test of throughput, a test of prioritization, a test of how quickly a system designed for precision begins to behave under volume. And once you start looking at it that way, the event itself becomes only the first layer. What matters more is what it reveals about the system underneath. Because if pressure at that level produces even small gaps, then those gaps are not accidents. They are signals. Signals about limits. Signals about design assumptions. Signals about what happens when theory meets sustained reality. And once those signals appear, the focus shifts from what happened to how the system was built to handle it in the first place. To understand why saturation matters, you have to start with what the system is actually designed to do. Because there is a common assumption that sits underneath most discussions of missile defense, that it functions like a shield. It doesn't. It functions like a filter. At its core, Iron Dome is not trying to intercept everything in the sky. It is trying to decide in real time what needs to be intercepted and what doesn't. That distinction is everything. When a rocket or missile is detected, the system immediately begins calculating its trajectory. Within seconds, it determines where that object is likely to land. Not approximately, but within a defined impact zone. If that predicted impact point falls in an unpopulated area, the system does nothing. No interceptor is launched. No engagement is attempted. Because every interceptor is a resource, and resources are finite. If the trajectory indicates a threat to populated areas, infrastructure, or strategic assets, then the system engages. A Tamir interceptor is launched. Guidance systems track both the incoming object and the interceptor simultaneously. A mid-air interception is attempted before impact. That entire cycle, detection, classification, decision, engagement, happens in seconds. Under normal conditions, this works extremely well. Because normal conditions assume something critical, manageable volume. The system is built around prioritization, not saturation. That means it performs best when incoming threats are spaced out, allowing the radar, control systems, and launchers to operate within predictable limits. But those limits exist. Each Iron Dome battery has a finite number of interceptors loaded and ready, a limited number of simultaneous engagements it can handle, a radar system processing multiple targets but not infinite ones. And this is where the first structural constraint appears: throughput. Not in theory, but in time. Because even if the system can track hundreds of objects, it still has to process them, classify them, and assign interceptors fast enough to matter. And when incoming volume increases, time becomes the bottleneck. The radar picture starts to densify. Instead of clean trajectories, you now have clusters, overlapping paths, objects arriving from different angles at slightly different intervals. That complexity forces the system to prioritize more aggressively. And prioritization always comes with trade-offs. Some targets are engaged immediately. Some are queued. Some are deprioritized based on projected impact zones. This is not a flaw. It is intentional. But intention is based on assumptions. And one of those assumptions is that incoming threats will not arrive faster than the system can meaningfully process them. A saturation attack challenges that directly because it does not just increase the number of threats, it compresses them into a narrower time window. That compression forces the system into a different operating mode, from precision to triage. At that point, interception becomes less about optimal outcomes and more about damage control. And that is where the second constraint becomes visible: interceptor availability. Each Tamir interceptor carries a significant cost, tens of thousands of dollars per unit. The incoming threats, by contrast, can be dramatically cheaper. This creates a cost asymmetry that matters over time. But more importantly, it creates a volume problem. Because no system can carry infinite interceptors, reloading takes time. Resupply requires logistics. And during an active barrage, neither happens instantly. So as engagements continue, inventory declines. And the system becomes increasingly selective. Not because it wants to be, but because it has to be. That selectivity tightens engagement criteria. Targets that might have been intercepted earlier are now evaluated more conservatively. The system begins conserving interceptors for higher confidence threats. And that changes the pattern of interceptions. Coverage becomes more concentrated. Risk becomes more unevenly distributed. The system is still functioning, but it is no longer operating at full freedom. Now layer another factor on top: attack complexity. Not all incoming threats behave the same way. Some follow predictable ballistic paths. Others maneuver slightly. Some are accompanied by decoys or fragmentation patterns that complicate tracking. Cluster-type payloads, for example, do not present as a single object at the moment of engagement. They can separate, creating multiple smaller threats from a single trajectory. From the system's perspective, that increases the number of objects that must be tracked, evaluated, and potentially intercepted. So what looked like one incoming threat becomes several, and that multiplies pressure instantly. At the same time, incoming objects can be timed in waves, not perfectly synchronized, but intentionally staggered to prevent clean defensive cycles. That means just as one engagement sequence completes, another begins before the system fully resets. No breathing room. No clean separation. Just continuous demand. And that is where design meets reality. Because Iron Dome was never meant to be an infinite barrier. It was designed to reduce damage, protect critical areas, buy time, maintain functionality under stress. It was not designed to guarantee zero penetration under sustained, high-volume attack. That expectation is often projected onto it from the outside. But the system itself operates on a different principle: acceptable loss under controlled conditions. Saturation breaks that control, not by destroying the system, but by forcing it into its limits. And once a system reaches its limits, behavior changes. Not abruptly, but measurably. Engagement timing shifts. Interceptor allocation tightens. Prioritization becomes sharper, sometimes harsher. And those changes are not errors. They are signals. Signals that the system is operating at the edge of its design envelope. So, when people ask whether Iron Dome failed under saturation, the question itself is slightly off. Because the system is doing exactly what it was built to do. The real question is different. At what point does the volume of incoming threats exceed the system's ability to meaningfully prioritize them? And once that point is crossed, what happens next? Because that is where the story stops being about defense architecture and starts being about the strategy designed to push it there in the first place. Saturation is not an accident. It is not the byproduct of launching a lot of missiles. It is a strategy. And more importantly, it is a strategy built around a very specific understanding. You do not need to destroy a defense system to defeat it. You only need to force it into conditions where its own logic starts working against it. Because once a system is forced to prioritize under pressure, it becomes predictable. And predictability can be exploited. At the center of this approach is volume, but not just raw numbers. Controlled volume, timed volume, layered volume. Iran's missile doctrine has moved steadily in this direction over time, not toward perfect accuracy, but toward overwhelming density. Instead of relying on a handful of high-precision strikes, the strategy leans on combinations. Ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, decoys. Each type serves a different function. Ballistic missiles create speed and compression. Cruise missiles introduce variability in altitude and approach angle. Drones add persistence and noise. Decoys complicate tracking and classification. Individually, none of these are guaranteed to penetrate a modern defense system. Together, they create friction, and friction, under time pressure, becomes failure at the margins. The key is sequencing. Not everything arrives at once. Instead, waves are timed so that defensive systems are never fully reset. Engagement cycles begin to overlap. Radar tracking never clears completely. Decision queues never empty. That constant load matters more than the peak. Because systems can handle spikes, what they struggle with is sustained compression. Imagine a defense network that can handle a certain number of simultaneous engagements at any given moment. Now increase the number of incoming threats slightly above that threshold, not dramatically, just enough to create strain. At first, nothing breaks. Then engagement timing tightens. Then prioritization sharpens. Then small delays begin to appear. And once delays appear, interception windows narrow. That is the hinge point. Because missile defense is not just about intercepting, it is about intercepting within a very specific time frame. Too early, and the geometry doesn't align. Too late, and the target is already too close to impact. Saturation compresses that window from both sides. Now add cost asymmetry. An interceptor costs tens of thousands of dollars. An incoming projectile can cost a fraction of that. But the financial imbalance is only part of the equation. The real advantage lies in production and availability. If one side can produce or deploy significantly more projectiles than the other can interceptors, then over time, volume becomes inevitable. Not overwhelming in a single moment, but cumulative. Every interception consumes a resource that cannot be instantly replaced. Every incoming wave chips away at inventory. And that turns time into a weapon. The longer the engagement continues, the more constrained the defense becomes. Which leads to a subtle but critical shift. The objective is no longer to saturate the system immediately. It is to sustain pressure long enough for saturation to emerge naturally. That distinction matters. Because a single massive barrage can be absorbed if the system has sufficient reserves and recovery time. But sustained, layered attacks erode those reserves. They force the system to operate continuously at high intensity. And continuous operation introduces wear, not mechanical wear, but decision fatigue at the system level. Algorithms must make faster choices. Operators must interpret denser data. Command structures must respond with less certainty. Even automated systems exist within human frameworks. And those frameworks are not infinite. Now, consider the psychological layer. From the attacker's perspective, perfect accuracy is not required. A small percentage of successful penetrations is enough to achieve strategic effect. Because each successful impact carries weight beyond its physical damage. It signals that the system can be breached. It introduces doubt. And doubt changes behavior. Civilian movement shifts. Economic activity slows. Confidence in protection erodes. That psychological dimension feeds back into the strategic equation. Because once defense is perceived as conditional, pressure amplifies without increasing volume. Now layer in complexity at the object level. Some incoming threats are designed not just to hit targets, but to complicate interception. Decoys can mimic real trajectories. Cluster payloads can multiply objects mid-flight. Low-altitude cruise profiles can reduce detection time. From the system's perspective, this increases the number of decisions that must be made under time constraint. And every additional decision consumes processing capacity. So what appears externally as 600 missiles may internally behave like a larger number of trackable objects. That multiplication effect accelerates saturation. But the most important element is not the weapons themselves. It is the logic behind their use. Saturation strategy is built on one core idea. You do not defeat a defense system by breaking it. You defeat it by forcing it to operate outside its optimal conditions. And optimal conditions are always bounded, defined by interceptor count, engagement rate, processing speed, prioritization logic. Push beyond those bounds, and the system adapts. Push further, and it constrains itself. Push continuously, and it begins to leak. Not everywhere, not catastrophically, but enough. And enough is all that is required. Because once leakage begins, the objective shifts. The attacker no longer needs to increase volume dramatically. The system is already under strain. The pressure sustains itself. And at that point, the engagement is no longer about whether the defense holds perfectly. It is about how long it can maintain acceptable performance under continuous stress. That is a different kind of question, one that does not have a clean technical answer, because it depends not just on hardware, but on logistics, economics, doctrine, and endurance. And once you see that, the barrage itself becomes less important than the pattern it represents. A pattern that is not limited to one region, not limited to one system, but increasingly relevant wherever high-cost defenses meet low-cost, high-volume threats. Which is why the implications do not stop at the immediate battlefield. They extend outward into how modern defense is structured, funded, and expected to perform under pressure. And that is where the problem begins to widen beyond any single system. Once saturation is no longer theoretical, the conversation changes. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to shift how these systems are understood. Because for years, missile defense has been presented and often perceived as a reliability problem. Does it work? Can it intercept? How accurate is it? Those are still valid questions. But after a sustained saturation event, they stop being the most important ones. The more important question becomes, how long can it keep working under continuous pressure? That is a different category of problem, not binary, not yes or no, but conditional. Because every modern defense system, not just Iron Dome, is built around limits. Limits in interceptor inventory. Limits in engagement rates. Limits in radar processing. Limits in logistics and resupply. Those limits are usually invisible during short engagements. They only become visible when time and volume combine. And once they become visible, they stop being local. They become systemic, because the same design logic exists across multiple defense architectures in different forms, with different capabilities, but with similar constraints. High-cost interceptors, finite inventories, selective engagement logic. Now extend that beyond one country. Consider U.S. bases across the Middle East. Consider NATO air defense networks. Consider naval carrier groups operating within range of missile systems. All of them rely on layered defense. All of them depend on interception capacity that is not infinite. All of them assume that incoming threat volume remains within manageable bounds. That assumption is now under pressure, because the logic demonstrated in a saturation scenario is not geographically limited. It is transferable. Any actor capable of producing or deploying sufficient volume, whether through missiles, drones, or mixed systems, can attempt to replicate the same pressure dynamics. Not perfectly, not identically, but effectively enough to test limits. And once those limits are tested, planning changes. Because defense is no longer evaluated solely on peak performance. It is evaluated on endurance. How long can the system sustain operations before constraints begin to reshape outcomes? That endurance question introduces new layers of complexity. Logistics becomes central. Interceptor production rates, supply chain resilience, transport and deployment timelines. All of these factors move from the background into the foreground, because if interceptors cannot be replenished at a rate that matches or exceeds usage, then over time, the system becomes increasingly constrained. Not suddenly, gradually, but predictably, and predictability is what strategic planning builds around. At the same time, cost begins to matter more. Not just the cost of building the system, but the cost of operating it continuously. If each interception carries a significant financial burden and incoming threats remain comparatively inexpensive, then sustained engagements create imbalance. Not immediately destabilizing, but cumulatively significant. Over time, that imbalance influences decision-making. Which threats are intercepted? Which engagements are prioritized? How long a system can remain active at high intensity? That introduces a second-order effect. Defense becomes not just a technical challenge, but an economic one. And economic constraints do not behave like physical ones. They do not break suddenly. They tighten, quietly, until they begin to shape outcomes in ways that are not immediately visible. Now consider infrastructure. Missile defense is not just about protecting cities. It is about protecting systems that support daily function. Airports, energy facilities, ports, communications networks. These are not interchangeable. They are interconnected. And when defense becomes conditional, when not everything can be intercepted, protection becomes selective, which means some systems absorb more risk than others. That introduces cascade potential, because disruption in one sector can propagate into others. A hit on energy infrastructure affects transportation. A disruption in ports affects supply chains. A failure in communications affects coordination. The target is no longer a single location. It is the network connecting them. And saturation, by forcing selective defense, increases the likelihood that some part of that network becomes exposed. Not completely, but enough. Enough to create friction. Enough to create delay. Enough to create instability. And that is where the broader implication begins to take shape. Because once you accept that no system can guarantee complete interception under sustained pressure, then defense shifts from prevention to management. Managing risk. Managing damage. Managing continuity. That is a fundamentally different posture. More realistic, but also more complex. It requires redundancy in infrastructure, flexibility in logistics, adaptability in response. It requires planning not just for success, but for controlled failure. And that idea is uncomfortable because it challenges the expectation of protection, but it aligns with the reality of constraint. So the event itself, 600 missiles in 3 hours, is not just a data point. It is a signal that modern defense systems, no matter how advanced, operate within boundaries. Boundaries defined by time, volume, cost, and coordination. And once those boundaries are approached, behavior changes. Not because the system stops working, but because it has to decide where it can keep working most effectively. So the question is no longer whether missile defense systems work. They clearly do. The question is where their limits are and how those limits shape the next phase of conflict. Because once those limits are understood, they are not ignored. They are studied, adapted to, and eventually tested again. Which means the real issue is not the last barrage. It is the next one, and whether the system facing it will be operating with more capacity or under even tighter constraints. If you want to keep tracking how these pressure points evolve, not just in one place, but across the systems they expose, stay with the channel.